Welcome to this webinar titled Community Acceptance, Wastewater to Drinking Water. My name is Anne Green and I'm Chair of the New South Wales Division of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, known as ATSE. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this function, which I'm sure you're going to find fascinating and very informative. So in the spirit of reconciliation, I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As we share our knowledge, I acknowledge the most ancient and enduring knowledge in the world, embedded forever in custodianship of country. So we're joined today by fellows of ATSE, as well as friends, collaborators and partners from across Australia and internationally. So welcome all. ATSE is a learned academy of independent experts, and we help Australians understand and use technology to solve complex problems. Our fellows are Australia's leaders in applied science, technology and engineering, and we bring them together to provide impartial, practical and evidence-based advice on how to achieve sustainable solutions and advance prosperity. So let me give you some logistics for today's webinar. Technical organisation is from the Secretariat of ATSE, and I thank them for their assistance. All participants will have their video and audio muted centrally. However, there will be ample time for questions at the end of the presentations. So please use the Q&A function and your questions will go to our moderator. So the webinar is also being recorded and will be posted to the ATSE website shortly. So for today's webinar, we've been fortunate to secure 4 eminent experts to explore the question of whether Australians are ready to accept treated wastewater for drinking. Controversial. For our future urban water needs, there's significant potential source of water available from wastewater treatment, and this appears to be more economic even than desalination. However, to implement the infrastructure necessary, a social license is required from the community. So this is the first hurdle to overcome before any technical and economic development can be considered further. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Stuart Khan, who will be the MC today and who will moderate the questions. So Professor Khan is a specialist in potable water recycling, water reclamation and advanced water treatment. And he is at the UNSW School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He's a member of Engineers Australia and also a member of the International Committee of Water Reclamation and Reuse. Stuart's research includes the fate of trace organic contaminants during water treatment processes, and with a particular emphasis on water recycling. So indeed an expert for our MC. So please, I'd like you to welcome Stuart as our MC. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Green. So welcome everybody. Today we have 3 excellent speakers who will be talking, as you just heard, about some of the social and acceptance angles of purified recycled water for drinking. So our first speaker is Dr. Kelly Fielding. Dr. Fielding is an associate professor in the School of Communication and Arts at the University of Queensland. And her research focuses on the psychology of environmental sustainability, with a particular interest in the social and psychological dimensions of urban water management. Dr. Fielding will speak to us today about critical barriers to the public acceptance of wastewater recycled to drinking water. Thank you, Dr. Fielding.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And so let me just get my slides to come up. I think that they are here, but unfortunately not on the first slide, so bear with me. We have our first, but hopefully only technical glitch for the morning, for the day. So I'm going to talk to you about the critical barriers to public acceptance of recycled water, and we've already been introduced to this idea that public acceptance is critical. And so I suppose what I've tried to do here is to kind of provide you with some imagery to bring home that issue of why public acceptance is so important. So these are images that highlight the operation of groups like in Queensland, we had the Citizens Against Drinking Sewage, the CADS group, but globally we've had these toilet to tap sort of campaigns that have been wheeled out when water authorities have looked to introduce potable recycled water schemes. In other words, recycled water schemes for drinking water purposes. And of course, the most salient example, I think, of that public opposition at play in Australia was the plebiscite that happened in Toowoomba. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Queensland geography, but Toowoomba is a small city that's about 2 hours west of Brisbane. And a plebiscite was put to that city during the Millennium Drought to ask them whether they would accept the introduction of recycled water for drinking, and the majority of the town's residents voted no. Now, this kind of failure, I think, looms very large in the consciousness of politicians, and it brings home to us the critical role that people, citizens, play in the introduction of potable recycled water schemes. So, and just before I sort of jump on to talk about those critical barriers, let me just show you some data that I've collected from a few years ago now as part of a project I ran in the Cooperative Research Centre for Water Sensitive Cities. And we asked people whether they would be willing to use recycled water for drinking or non-drinking purposes. And you can see that very high levels of willingness to use it for non-drinking purposes and much less for drinking purposes. Now, I've seen data that looks a lot more favourable than this. This was a few years ago, but it highlights one of those disjunctions between what we're willing to use recycled water for that I will return to in a few moments. So a couple of years ago, along with my colleague Sarah Dolnicher here at University of Queensland, who's done a lot of research about recycled water, and my PhD student Tracy Schultz, we went out and had a look at all of the literature up till that point in time that existed, looking at the predictors of people's willingness or acceptance to use recycled water predominantly for potable or drinking water uses. When we brought it together, we synthesized it, wrote a long review article, happy to share it with anyone who's interested. And because it is a long review article, we thought it was a good idea to try to synthesize this down into a nice graphic. And so what you have here is a summary of kind of key predictors that have been explored in relation to people's acceptance of recycled water. And so this column on the left shows all of the studies that have been conducted that show a positive link between these factors and public acceptance. And the one on the right shows some studies that either don't show a link or show the opposite. So what I want to do in the remainder of my talk is to focus on the top 5, the ones that there's quite a lot of evidence to show that there's a link between this factor and public acceptance, as a way to highlight what are people's key concerns or what are key factors that could help to increase acceptance. So let's start with this first one, this issue of personal contact. And essentially, the data is very clear. If I just go back, you can see there's been 43 studies that we managed to identify as part of our review. And these studies all show exactly the same pattern. So this is some data from my colleague Sarah Dolnicher. It's quite old data, so I think that we've moved on in terms of the percentages for drinking at least. And what this figure shows is the dark line is the percentage of people who express a willingness to use recycled water. The white line is for desalinated water. Forget about the white line. We're just focusing on recycled water today. It's a very clear pattern. If you ask people whether they're willing to use recycled water for something that they don't come into contact with, flushing the toilet, watering the garden, irrigating a golf course, an overwhelming majority of people will say, yeah, sure, no problems. Okay, where you get a really steep decline or radical drop-off in acceptance is when you start asking people about using recycled water for things that they come into contact with. So much less support if it's about showering, or taking a bath, or even washing your clothes, and especially for drinking. So that's a very low number. As I said, I've seen data that shows much higher numbers than that. It's quite old data. But I guess what I wanted to demonstrate here to you is that pattern. And that pattern is one that you see over and over and over again across many, many studies. So let me move on and talk about risk perceptions. Now, health risk perceptions in particular are really a key driver of people's acceptance of recycled water, but they're also a driver of people's acceptance more broadly of kind of technological related risks. And so, you know, the higher the risk perceptions, the lower acceptance, and vice versa. Let me just show you a couple of comments to sort of illustrate the sort of things that people say to you about recycled water if you go out and talk to them. So they'll say, look, we're worried about hospital waste and pathogens and radio, you know, nuclear, blah, 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 things that are going to negatively impact on their health. And interestingly, people will also recognize that, you know, that there's, you know, that recycled water comes from a system, right? And the system could break down. And so there's a recognition that if the system fails, then that might also have a negative impact on my health. So if you're looking to introduce a recycled water scheme, then, you know, reassuring people of the checks and balances in the system is going to be really critical to reassure them about the, you know, the risks related to that recycled water scheme. Let me move on now and talk about the role of knowledge or experience. So there's quite a number of studies. The majority of the studies show a link between having greater knowledge or experience of recycled water and acceptance. And that's definitely something that I've seen in my own research. So again, returning to that project, that big national survey that we did with Australians, over 5,000 people were surveyed. Even when you measure people's kind of general water-related knowledge, what we call water literacy, you see that people who've got more knowledge about water-related issues also have greater support for alternative water sources, including recycled water, as well as a bunch of other positive water-related outcomes. Now, I've also done some experimental research that demonstrates that there is a causal link between providing people with information and their risk perceptions and support. So in this experiment, well, actually it was a series of experiments, we randomly assigned to people to be in a control group where they didn't get any information, or to two groups where they got information. And when we provided people with that information, we were addressing those concerns that we knew to be important. So those health risk concerns and those concerns about the safety. So you can see that the information says, look, purified recycled water is cleaned and purified to very high standards. It meets strict water quality and health standards. It makes the process makes the water safe. We showed people the actual process, all of the different kind of treatment processes that gets it to the point where it's actually safe to drink. And for one of those information groups, we also wanted to try to put the very, very small risk that was entailed with recycling water into perspective. So we got this information from the then National Water Commission, which talked about this idea of 6-star, you know, drinking water, which is the purified recycled water. And we said to people, again, information we got from the National Water Commission, a person drinking 2 litres of 6-star water daily would need 138,000 years to consume 100 milligrams of a pharmaceutical product. That's like half the dose of a headache tablet. And so when we gave people that information, what you can see here in these graphs is that the people who got the information about the safety and all the processes that it goes through, that, you know, wastewater goes through to be recycled, had lower risk perceptions than when they didn't get that information, than the group that didn't get that information. They had greater support than the group that didn't get the information. When we offered them the chance to drink recycled water, they drank more of it than the people who didn't get the information. And when we said to them, well, if there was going to be a recycled water scheme introduced into your region, would you vote for or against that? You can see when they didn't get the information, the dominant response is, I would vote against. But when they did get the information, the dominant response was, I would vote in favour. And in fact, when they got that perspective information, a majority said they would vote in favour. So this is evidence of the causal link between, you know, addressing through information people's concerns about how it happens and the fact that the processes make it the wastewater safe to drink, and people's risk perceptions and their acceptance. Let me move on now and talk about the role of emotion. So we all like to think that we reach our risk perceptions through, you know, a kind of very considered and logical process of weighing up the sort of costs and benefits. But the reality is that there's a lot of theory and research to show that sometimes we judge something to be risky because we have a particular emotional response to it. And so when it comes to recycled water, the most common response is this so-called yuck factor, or the feeling of disgust that people experience because they're focusing on where the water comes from rather than what the water becomes. And so here's a couple of example quotes. You know, it's the yuck factor, it's the sort of mental image of the brown solids to clear liquids. Just as an aside, I got interviewed a few years ago by a local ABC radio announcer who said, "So Kelly, how do we convince people to drink recycled sewage?" And I said, well, the first thing we do is we don't call it that. So just to give you an example of how if you focus people on what the water becomes, that can make a difference. Again, I ran an experimental study which either sort of framed recycled water in terms of, you know, trying to elicit people's positive emotions by calling it purified water, you know, by showing, you know, a lovely scene of somebody drinking really clear water, or the negative emotional framing, which is talking about sewage and kind of showing a water treatment plant. And then when you look at the results, you can see that when people have that kind of positive affective framing, when we try to elicit those positive emotions, you get lower risk perceptions and higher support than when we do that negative affective framing or if we don't provide people with information. So again, experimental evidence of the causal link between emotions and people's risk perceptions and support in relation to recycled water. And of course, you know, we're one step behind water authorities who I think already know that you know, focusing people on what the water becomes is really critical. So an example here is the Pure Water Scheme in San Diego or the New Water Scheme in Singapore, which is really, again, as I said before, focusing people on the very pure, water that is the outcome of the technical processes that the wastewater goes through. Look, the final thing I want to just focus on today, and you can see that there are other predictors, but I really focused in on those sort of top predictors, is this issue of trust. And I think anyone who knows anything about sort of public opposition or public acceptance knows that trust is a really critical factor. Here's just a figure that I pulled out of a paper that I have with one of my former PhD students, Vicky Ross, which shows very clearly, and this is replicated in other research, that if people have higher trust in the authority who has to deliver the recycled water scheme, then they have lower risk perceptions and higher acceptance. And interestingly, Vicky's research was able to show that trust was underpinned by a sense that the authority had credibility, and that sense of credibility came from a sense that they're one of us, that they're part of our community, and that they're actually using fair procedures in relation to that recycled water scheme. So that was a pattern of results that she showed across a number of different contexts. Of course, you know, there's also the issue of trust in scientists, because, you know, this is a scientific and technical process. And, you know, I'm sure many of you know that, you know, people fall into two camps. Certainly in our research, more people fall in the trust science than in the don't trust science camp. So you can see that this quote here from someone saying, look, I don't really know, so I need to trust the scientists to tell me that it's okay. Whereas you do get people who say, look, the scientists, they've been wrong in the past, they could be wrong again. And again, our research shows, you know, and this has been replicated across a number of our studies, that when people have greater trust in scientists and greater trust in government, that they have greater comfort with a range of alternative water sources for drinking, including recycled. What do we do with all that information? Well, we use it to try to develop effective communication and engagement plans. So the research tells us that we should provide accurate and transparent information that addresses people's key concerns. Even if we think those concerns are crazy, we need to address them, and we need to do it in a way that helps to build trust. We need to use trustworthy sources. If your organisation isn't trusted, then try to partner with one that is. We need to use the right terminology. We need to use terminology that focuses on people on what the water becomes. And we need to engage early, often and fully. The examples of schemes getting overturned or not being implemented are usually the outcome of fairly kind of reactive and short-term processes. Where those schemes have been successful, it's usually because there's been a long-term communication and engagement process. Here's a couple of examples. So this happened in San Diego, but also in Perth. You know, in Perth, there was a 3-year trial. You know, there was websites, online forums, presentations, a visitor centre, monitoring data that was, you know, shown on the website. So this is a long process. It wasn't an overnight process. So I have no idea. I think I'm running on time. I hope I'm running on time. Let me leave you with my take-home messages. There is a lot of research about the factors of public acceptance, large and growing body of research, and we should use those insights to develop effective communication and engagement. And as I said, you know, the case studies show very clearly that early and continued engagement is a key ingredient for the successful implementation of recycled water schemes for drinking water purposes. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fielding. To the audience, remember that there will be opportunities to ask questions. There'll be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So please do drop your questions into the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll be going through those, and I'll be pulling out some of the most pertinent, challenging questions to put to the panel members. So our second speaker today is Dr. Amit Chanan. Dr. Chanan is an experienced senior executive with a career spanning over 2 decades within the Australian and international water industry and infrastructure services. He's currently the Director of City Projects and Property with the City of Sydney in Australia. Dr. Chanan's presentation is titled Wastewater Recycling in Our Cities. Can the Abyss be Crossed in One Step? Thank you, Dr. Chanan.
Thank you, Stuart. I'll share my screen. For discussions around water recycling, and I feel that there's always this sort of essentially people are in these two groups where some of us can happily walk into a room and pick up a bottle of new water from Singapore and gulp it down, and there are others who would sort of pull their face at the idea, and that is what I've described as an abyss in my talk. And there are, you know, as Professor Field just covered in her talk, there are reasons behind it. You know, there are, you know, elements of psychological barriers and yuck factor. Before I go any further, I must declare I belong to the first group. I have drunk the new water, and so have my 80-year-old father, in fact. In the next 20 minutes, I will talk quite a bit in analogies, in fact. I will talk about Her Majesty the Queen. I will talk a bit about Indiana Jones, and if time's left, that we might come back to recycling as well. So let's start with a project that I think all of you are quite familiar with, and it is it was quite a controversial project, and I can assure you, all of you have been party to this project. If you look at the acceptance, you know, the 2 lines, for and against lines to this project from when the idea first was tested with the community, the eternal optimist in me sees the blue line, which is gradually gaining support. And I think with a rightly structured program of community engagement and information, you could get to a point where, in fact, the acceptance far exceeds the rejection of the idea, and that's quite an encouraging line to see. What about Her Majesty the Queen, did I hear you ask? In fact, this project that I'm talking about is actually the project about our systems of governance. The red line is representing our acceptance of monarchy, and the blue line is our acceptance of republic. If you look at since 1953, our opinions on how we like Australia to be governed, you would see that there has been a gradual increase in the blue line of people accepting the republic. And if you are wondering what is the reason why I'm sharing this, there is quite a significant parallel between this referendum and this debate and the referendum that we had in Toowoomba, and how the community got divided between recycling and desalination. This bit here on that plot in particular is around the time very close to the vote when the series of information or misinformation, depending on your perspective, started to hit the community. Just to refresh your memories, this is what the referendum election ended up being. It was about our flag. It was about whether or not we will be able to protect the Anzac Day. It was about not giving more power to politicians. And there is quite a lot of literature out there already that talks about why the whole referendum on Republic failed. Just in the interest of time and to support my hypothesis, I'm only going to focus on the work of Ian McAllister from ANU and his co-author John Hiley from Texas. And two particular things from their conclusion that I wanted to quote. One of them was that voters had only dim knowledge about how our constitutional system works and no insight into what the proposed changes would involve. The other one is that voters who thought a republic was a good idea were split between those who voted for an indirect presidency and those who voted for a direct elected president. And if you think about it, in many ways, the idea of republic and the idea of monarchy and the debate that we've had especially during the Millennium Drought, there were a lot of parallels. For average Joe or Jill, they didn't really have enough information. Without disclosing your political allegiances, if you reflect on that we are still a monarchy, and you think about how we got why the referendum failed, a lot of us often reflect that we can't believe that was the outcome at the end of it. And it's no different to another referendum, and Professor Field already shared some of these images. 62% of the vote people who voted in Toowoomba's recycling referendum voted against the idea of recycled water. If I use the phrase from the previous slide, average voters only had dim knowledge of how water treatment works. And if I reflect on the water community at the time, and in fact, even till today, in terms of water recycling, those for water recycling, how we bring in the terms portable, non-portable, direct portable, indirect portable, and how that leads to an element of confusion amongst the community. It's very similar to how and where the Republicans ended up, in my view. And yes, the Toowoomba referendum was not just about Toowoomba. It had lasting impact on the selection of options across the eastern seaboard. It had lasting impact on every city in terms of what option they picked as a drought response measure. I'm familiar with the Sydney's drought response planning. At the time, I was involved in a different capacity. And I know, and it's a public known fact, that the trigger to go down the desalination path, in fact, was meant to be when the storage level hit 30%. And we never really got there. A bit like the other referendum, till this day, we talk about in our water communities, everybody I know of, and we wonder, how did we get there? It's an interesting predicament that we face as a community. There's some good work by Dr. Anna Hurlman and Sarah Donlicher that Professor Field talked about. They've done some case study research into the Toowoomba referendum, and the council, in fact, felt that the referendum was pretty much forced upon them, because Commonwealth funding came with a condition that they need to do a referendum. And this work also highlights that Toowoomba Council's preferred approach, in fact, was meant to be a 3-year consultation program where they would have brought the community along in terms of the educational journey. It is an important point to note because, in my opinion, local government, when you compare any tier of government, in fact, local government are the experts in engaging with their local community. And the view that Toowoomba had, the original plan that Toowoomba had, if we had had that opportunity, it would have been perhaps a different outcome. Who knows? But one thing is clear, that every time we try to jump the abyss in one leap, we run the risk of falling through. And that's where I bring in my favorite series of Indiana Jones. I might just quickly play, if it works. It's a scene from The Last Crusade. For those of you who couldn't hear what Sean Connery, his father said, he said, "You must believe, boy." And it is a lot about belief, and especially for those who are on the leading edge of the bell curve. We often take leap of faith, and those leap of faiths are important in moving the industry in the direction we want to go. I just wanted to share a couple of slides. The next few slides are about some of the small leaps of faith while the community was busy in the debate around portable and then, direct or indirect reuse. What was happening in Sydney, and some of these projects I was personally involved with, was the first ever water mining project in Sydney, where we connected to sewer in January 2006. When we first approached the utility with the idea of doing that, we were pretty much told to go away because it's a stupid idea. It's a completely risky, dangerous thought. And I think in many ways the persistence paid off, and we were given the permission to connect. At the same time, I should also point out that the community wasn't also quite ready for that. We had lots of discussions with parents who were worried that their kids will play on the sports fields, which will be irrigated with recycled water. And there were golfers who were worried about picking their balls that might be touching recycled water that will be used to irrigate the golf course. So in terms of the sort of big project thinkers out there who want to develop some massive reuse scheme, you might ask the question about what difference this small project could have made. And the answer to that is, this project in fact was a precursor to Water Industry Competition Act in New South Wales. This is an image of Maurice Yama, the Premier at the time, who in fact for the first time, and he's holding a raw sewage rather, and treated water in his hand, and he announced at the time that recycling is the first line of defense against drought. So there was quite a shift in communities' acceptance just by having few pilot projects and just by having a real life project to demonstrate that what technology can do. I agree that this small project was not at the time ready for drinking, and this small step at the time was not about portable reuse, but I would point out that was a very important first step, and every project ever since has been taking us on a journey, another step closer to crossing the abyss we are all collectively trying to cross. In the organization that I work at the moment, City of Sydney, we've got nearly 17 schemes out there, from rainwater, stormwater, wastewater recycling and reuse, which are all about bringing community closer to recycling and ensuring that recycling has a legitimate place in our urban form. Recycling has a legitimate place in our city. And that legitimacy is really important when we talk about social licensing. This is just another project that we're currently working on, which is looking at creating a scheme of connected wastewater prosumers, where large buildings, hotels, and institutions will be connected to a grid. There will be consumers and producers. Another project that is bringing recycling closer to the community and building credibility on the technology that is now available to recycle water. Returning to the topic of social licensing, I think it is important to understand that the literature says that social license is when a project has an ongoing approval in the community, and the word is ongoing approval. In my current role, and I think anybody in local government, in infrastructure delivery game rather, would understand that to have ongoing approval, it is more than once standing in front of community and saying this is the solution you're getting. It is a journey. It is a journey of co-creating solutions, and it is a journey of describing where we are trying to get to. It is not uncommon in city, and I'm quite proud of that, that we can revisit designs when there is community reluctance to accept a particular infrastructure project. And it can be frustrating, it can be time consuming, but there are no shortcuts to attaining social license. And if you are delivering infrastructure at the 11th hour when the drought's already at its extreme, the likelihood of you having time to gain that social license is very little. And often then planning rules are used to allow to disregard social license, and we end up with solutions we end up. Right time to discuss social licensing is in fact now, and I really give credit to ETSI for having this conversation, because we need to be having those conversations and getting the community legitimacy and credibility and building that trust which is needed to get to where we are all keen to get to. I think in terms of in terms of the project, why that legitimacy is important. Just one last comment on that before I move to the next one, is that without trust, asking community to take that leap of faith, to asking community to say that you can pick that glass up and drink, is absolutely not possible. And the reality in my mind is that we don't have very many places in Australia where we can say that we've actually gone through those stages of building social license. I certainly believe that in places like City of Sydney, there is a lot of journey that's taken place. We have built a social license where there is definitely legitimacy of recycling. There is definitely credibility around recycling projects, and what that does is it allows us to have a conversation with the community about the crossing the abyss one day. But it is also important to note that there are many projects out there where large projects were built and mothballed. In my personal view, those mothballed projects are not an acceptance of credibility. In fact, in many ways, those mothballed projects, you might have to go back and rebuild that legitimacy and credibility before you can expect community to trust. So in a nutshell, I just want to summarize by saying, maybe using another analogy, and that is from the economy theory of gradualism versus shock therapy. I'm of the view that if we want community to cross this abyss, we can't use shock therapy to do that. We have tried and it didn't work. The only way we can get across this abyss is through the gradualism. And I think where we have active familiarity with the water recycling projects, places like City of Sydney, there is already a presence of legitimacy, presence of credibility, people to be able to experience science, and that then lends itself for an opportunity to then have that next conversation. Whereas where we have large pieces of infrastructure mothballed, we might have to go back and start building that legitimacy again. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Amit. Plenty to think about there and to learn from for future projects. So do remember that you have the opportunity to ask questions. There'll be a Q&A at the end, and please put any questions into the Q&A function on Zoom. So our final speaker is Dr. Our final speaker is Dr. Katherine Daniell. Dr. Daniell is an associate professor and interim associate dean of education in the College of Engineering and Computer Science at the Australian National University. She's the research lead at the 3A Institute and part of ANU's Fenner School of Environment and Society. Her research and impact are driven by collaborative approaches to policy, education, and action for more sustainable forms of development. Dr. Daniell currently serves as a member of the National Committee on Water Engineering for Engineers Australia, and she's director and board member of the Peter Cullen Water and Environment Trust. Dr. Daniell will now speak to us about navigating politics, cultures, and values underlying social licensing for water reuse. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stuart, and thank you to ATSI as well for inviting me and for that generous introduction, Stuart. Today I wanted to draw on some themes of the first two speakers, but I also want to expand our discussion about this issue of communities' acceptance of wastewater reuse to the broader global scale, because I think there are changes at this scale and different societal cultures and values that can further shape our understanding of some of the mechanics and politics at play, particularly that Amit's already talked about. My working theory is that there's a question of acceptability of purified recycled water for drinking. It only has a little bit to do with technology and its safety, and it's instead often about alternative views of what's normal and desirable for the future of our water systems writ large. And I think these are underpinned by different cultures within which there are embedded values, and we see this clash through politics and conflict over the use of recycled water, as we've already had some great examples today. Now, I think in some ways that these aren't dissimilar to all of the other clashes over our water futures that we're experiencing in Australia and around the world. And this includes related to water futures for Indigenous peoples and the need to acknowledge this idea of aqua nullius, like terra nullius, is still actually a dominant value system on our continent. And with that, I want to begin by acknowledging, like Anne, the traditional owners of the land upon which we're all co-present today. In my case, it's Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, never ceded, always sacred. And I want to pay my respects to the elders past and present of this place and of all other places from which we have connected together today. Indigenous peoples are the first water technologists and transformed their societies and cultures through the ingenious use of knowledge of water, the environment and community needs. And like Biamese Nunu, you can see here, the Borona fish traps, estimated to have served communities continuously from over 40,000 years ago until the beginning of the last century. I think that this really sets Australian gold standard for sustainable water management systems for all of us to reflect on. Today, I'm going to build out the idea and theory I just spoke about by presenting a short story in 3 parts to you. The first starts from the global level by developing some key water futures scenarios for us to consider. The next part then uses a model of culture as a tool for understanding the values that can underlie these scenarios and others. And then the third part, I'm going to look at an example application of this model and some scenarios for unpicking and better understanding the politics of Australian wastewater reuse. And like the other speakers, I'm also going to concentrate on South East Queensland. So what I want to do first is to zoom out and allow us to think about the global challenges and risks that might be impacting our water futures over the coming years and decades. And this is in order to shape some plausible and meaningful scenarios that we can discuss together. To begin with, we can think about what science and our measurements of a range of aspects of our Earth system and socioeconomic system around the world tell us. This snapshot of human impacts and Earth system responses is what colleagues of mine at ANU, like Will Stephan and others around the globe, call the Great Acceleration. Looking specifically at some closely linked to many water managers' concerns, we obviously have major challenges linked to growing populations in urban areas, and what this population growth means for resource use in terms of energy, water and materials, and the impact that mining these has on environmental degradation and climate. I think something important, and we've talked a bit this morning around science. Science can tell us about what the state of the world currently is and what's likely if trends continue. But deciding on our water futures is also very much about policy and governance choices, not just about science. And so it also needs to consider human values, actions, and be ready for surprises. And in terms of these surprises, challenges and means for reflecting on multiple paths forward, what I want to do here is to chart out a scenario development process using Karl Popper's work on clocks and clouds that we can use for our purposes. And this is inspired from a process I was involved in with the South Australian government a few years ago. We can consider clocks as physical systems that are regular, orderly and highly predictable, and clouds as complex systems that are disorderly with more or less unpredictability. Now, across these different categories, there can be multiple flags that we can look at to create our scenarios. I've already alluded to the socioeconomic and earth systems trends previously. Most of these are largely clockwork trends, even if some might have cloudy edges. And what I want to do here is briefly hone in on a range of flags that political leaders, including our own, consider in order to develop a few key scenarios that represent alternative directions and values for water futures. And hence I want to think about what water futures might need to consider and what the possibilities for integrating recycled wastewater into each of these might be. So obviously one of the biggest clockwork and cloudy flags affecting how we manage water is the green flag. This is the one where most water managers focus their time on. It's linked to environmental issues and climate change, including droughts, fires, algal blooms, pollution impacts, floods, and all those things we've seen over the last couple of years and decades. But in addition, there are a whole range of other clockwork trends to focus on. And I think these are quite important. So we've got things like the ageing population or the grey flag and how our lives at work are massively changing, like the fact that this event is online today. We have a whole range of others like the technological shifts here shown as the Kondratiev flag that are also likely to be key. And these include things like the rise of artificial intelligence, clean energy and quantum computing. Now, these flags have all been around for a long time. And I suppose it's only now that this pandemic flag is here that we can see how we can also think about wastewater, including, tracing of the virus prevalence in populations. That's one of Stuart's main activities. Now, there are a whole range of other global geopolitical flags, including actions of states like Russia and the rise of the Asian superpowers. We have religious instabilities, and one that I find particularly interesting and in some ways linked to wastewater is the anti-establishment flag, which is exemplified by social movements like Occupy Wall Street, hipsters, and more recently, the Black Lives Matter protests. Just taking a few of these together with the green flag, we can then develop a structure for some scenarios, but there are obviously many more that could also be envisaged. So if we take two axes that you can see here, resource capture versus respect, and then increasing centralisation or fragmentation, we can see that we can develop four quite different scenarios. So if we step through each of these scenarios, the first one, our community, is linked to things like decentralised planning, the idea of having self-sufficiency, community management, being able to have a fairly minimal environmental footprint and not very much regulatory oversight. If we move down towards the capture end, the next one is around sort of each to his own, where we're looking at more differentiated management systems. And here you're likely to get an inequity of service based on the available resources that individuals have. If we move down towards centralisation, we can think about a monopolisation type scenario where you may have very centralised integrated systems, elite control of planning agendas, equality of service, strong regulatory oversight, and some capture. And then the last one, if we move back towards the side of respect, we get more sort of a bells and whistles type scenario where there may be eco-technology, integrated multi-stakeholder planning and management, regulated competition and trade to drive different types of innovation. Now, As these are all quite generic, the next opportunity we have here is to consider these in, say, urban water in Australia or in a certain locality. And you may already see elements of these in all of our own systems today. And if we imagine out 10 years, we can also try to think about the current likelihood of moving in such a direction. And I think this is where we've really got choices, and within these scenarios and others, how we might integrate different types of recycled water strategies. For the second part of the story, what I wanted to do is to reflect on what types of cultures and values might underlie each of these scenarios. And I want to ask, well, can they tell us anything about what proponents of each of these might fear in others, and how we might need to orientate the use of purified recycled water or its equivalent to gain greater levels of social acceptability for such schemes. And this will draw on some of the issues that our other speakers have talked about. First of all, though, I think it's helpful to define what I mean by culture, which for me incorporates practices, rituals, symbols, social norms, frameworks that are able to influence both our thinking and doing. And I think it's helpful if we think of culture as a collective phenomenon. It's not just an individual, and it's a result of learning that's linked to the construction of meaning in a shared social environment, whether that be physical, virtual, or religious. And I think all of us are parts of different cultures, we're parts of different groups, disciplines, and nation states, and each of these can have a number of dominant or subcultures that can be evoked in water management and shape our outcomes. Now, whole disciplines have sought to understand types of basic human values and cultures, and I think one of my favourite scholars is Mary Douglas, who sought to model the effects of a few basic forms of social organisation on the way people classify, perceive, know and act. And in her book, Natural Symbols, she conceives these as consisting of two different dimensions. She thinks about a group's relative openness or closeness and the degree to which a group's relationships are more or less regulated. It is these dimensions, named group, the openness dimension, and grid, or the rules dimension, that form the basis of her grid group theory or cultural theory. And you can see in each of these quadrants here, it represents an ideal type, all of which are typically co-present to various degrees in different societies and governance systems. And here, although not purposefully aligned, we can see that the scenarios previously presented certainly have elements of these in them and can allow us to think through important aspects of social acceptability and what it might look like for groups of people, including water managers, who might want to align with such cultural orientations. So bringing these back to our scenarios, each one of these competing value sets is also reflected in part of some of these scenarios. Perhaps naturally there's a reasonable split between egalitarians on the resource respect side and fatalists on the resource capture side. If we take these away again, we've then also got individualists on the fragmentation side with a bit on the other bit, and our hierarchists on the centralised side. But as you can see, there's quite a bit of overlap in each of these scenarios, and I think that really shows the complexity of real life and just how complicated it can be for us to communicate. I'm going to talk about communication in a minute. But for the third part of the story now, I want to investigate how these kind of scenarios and the values underpinning them link to the challenges we're seeing for the implementation of different types of recycled water use, including for drinking water that Amit in particular was talking about. So here I want to give one example that reflects two relatively different scenarios and to show how these competing views reflect different values and perspectives, and hence why sometimes the development of recycled water system can be quite vexed. For this, I want to draw on some research that was undertaken with colleagues and published in the Journal of Hydrology a few years ago on the challenges of implementing a community level development with an integrated water cycle management strategy. And this included Class A recycled water in southeastern Queensland. This was a typical, I suppose, our community style or eco style development that was seeking to potentially contribute potable water back to the external grid through all of its water harvesting capabilities. First, I want to present what happened when the developer proposed it. And here I'm going to take perspectives from sort of both sides, and I'm going to step through the decision-making process and what went on, starting here from the perspective of the developer. So we had the developer who presented the design I just showed you and submitted it to the local council. The local council had to see whether or not this suited their strategy and all the rules and regulations. And the general view was that it didn't necessarily, and that they needed to get some advice on whether or not what had been proposed was going to be okay with the current Southeast Queensland strategy. They brought in consultants to do some work to understand the assumptions that were inside this. But at the same time that this process was going on in discussions with state government, there was also some protests around the proposed price rises in the system there, and this meant that it was quite easy for journalists to get involved. There was conflict, which is always helpful for getting extra media. And the developer was also able to get some consultants to develop other types of science that showed that the assumptions that were made were reasonable and that this development would do what it said it would do. They had local councillors on board as well. And these consultants ended up lobbying the federal government for financing to put this particular process in place, and the state government was given the financing for it. What ended up happening was one of the councillors preferred to stay with the current state strategy, and that was sort of the end. And I think what we can think about from the local development coalition perspective is what kind of cultural values they were coming up against here. So if we think about on the red side, here they can see there's a bit of egalitarian presented in terms of concern about social inequalities, particularly around a differentiation of service. Putting this new development in place would mean that not everyone would be connected to the same grid. They would have different types of water. And there's a clear hierarchist perspective where protecting existing power structures that protect their interests as a dominant social order and centralised control over the resource for the region is quite important. But we can also look at this from the other perspective, as I think innovation uptake in the water sector is not just about one innovation. It often masks conflict over two competing innovations or preferred types of systems, for example, centralised or decentralised. And they may set different types of lock-in paths for the future and hence have the potential to create significant societal and political conflict. And in this particular situation, we're looking at Southeast Queensland and how much of the water grid is currently organised and how it's currently organised, including supply options from dam, desalination and recycled water, and with an ambition one day of hopefully being able to use, as they've stated, the purified recycled water as an option for refilling the dam if levels drop too low. So if you take this particular perspective, we take it on the other side, you can see that lots of investment's already gone into this governance system and that we can also stand in their shoes to observe the process. And like before from this perspective, we can read the opposing cultural viewpoints, but I'm going to just step through it again. So if we start off with the local government, we can see that there's this new development that's being brought in. It seems like it's not going to fit with the current strategies and requirements. So they get together. They find some support and some science that shows that is not the case. At the same time, they do see this community outrage. They see a coalition being brought together and a whole lot of media and all that kind of stuff that says they don't want sort of higher prices. This group is pretty effective, manages to get funding, but they do manage to convince that one of the local councillors that it is better to stick with the current strategy. So we can read the opposing cultural viewpoints again, sort of looking at on the red side, we can see there's quite a bit of sort of individualistic thinking. These people probably have fear of restrictions on their autonomy and not being able to develop their own innovative wastewater recycling system and all the rest, and that they could be locked into price rises and held captive. There's also a strong egalitarian concern on this side about social injustice, here more linked to a lack of local sustainability and price. And egalitarians are also known to often support so-called social deviants, like protesters who dislike authority. And we can see a bit of that anti-establishment trend here. And so there's an emphasis on environmental fragility and that it may get out of balance if it's too controlled. So this is the end of this particular example, and in terms of outcomes, both sides ended up implementing some parts of their system. The development was put in place, the grid was extended, but the local recycling systems and much of the sort of integrated water cycle management didn't go ahead. And I suppose South East Queensland also hasn't yet been able to use its recycled water for refilling the dam, but it does use it elsewhere. So what can we learn from this three-part story? I think that each representation of the system and the embedded meaning linked to the particular configurations of technology, humans, and the environment here are important to different people, even if this is largely subconscious. And I think attributing meaning from our experiences and values is a really normal part of us making sense of the world and information that is provided to us. And we need to remember this when discussing different technologies and pathways like the use of purified recycled water. Groups sharing these cultural values will care about quite different things. And so messaging effectively to align with each of these can be really important. So for example, hierarchists are likely to be interested in safety and in maintaining high levels of control of the system. So the science that proves, as Kelly was talking about, efficacy of a particular water management option like purified recycled water may work here. For individualists, the autonomy, competition and choice are really important. So including opportunities for innovation or new business models, new wastewater markets or pricing options might be of interest and benefit to local businesses. And then the egalitarians may find science showing environmental and human risks convincing, often on the other side, and they may have a need to find out and build social consensus on how proposed options can help protect the environment and vulnerable people. And then fatalists can come in many guises, protesters and the disenfranchised or apathetic, and they will likely be cynical and untrusting of information from positions of power generally. So to conclude, considering the option of purified recycled water could mean many things to different groups in society. And I think trust underpinning social licensing will come based on alignment of the narrative with values that those people care about. And each group will only likely consider science aligned with their visions and values of the future too. And anything else is likely to be too much effort for most. And I think if we think about the political climate wars, and if they've taught us anything, I think it's that it's not about the science or technology, but fundamental values, cultures and politics. And we thus need to learn not to repeat the same mistakes when developing futures for recycled water. And specifically, we really need to work with the assumption that we need to connect our narratives to a whole range of people who often don't share the same values as ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine, and thank you for our three excellent speakers. We have time now for a Q&A session, and we have some great questions that have been coming in through the Q&A facility. Fine to send more in as we're talking if they come to you. But I'll start first with a comment that was received from Janine, saying that she very much agrees with Amit's comments around the need for gradual building of the system rather than just trying to leap the abyss in a single bound as such. So the need for gradual building to grow that social license as we go along. David also sent much of a comment, and I guess it's a rhetorical comment or a rhetorical question. Is there any country in Europe which does not routinely recycle water for drinking? And I'm sure we can all think of examples such as the Rhine that makes its way down from Switzerland and Austria through Germany and France and ends up in the Netherlands. And on the way down, every country takes its drinking water out of the river and discharges wastewater back in. And so there is recycling going on in that sense. Martin gave a similar, more specific example. And he says, I've heard that in London, every molecule of water passes on average through 7 kidneys. I think we've all heard this one. If this is true, and if we in Australia are using the same or more advanced wastewater purification technologies than are used in London, why is it taking us so long to gain acceptance of this proven technology? So in other words, I guess what Martin and David are both alluding to is that de facto potable reuse, unplanned potable reuse happens everywhere. We're proposing to do it better than that with higher technology. What's the problem? Anybody like to have a go at that one?
Stuart, can I just jump in momentarily? Because of course, this is something that is often said by people who are proponents of, potable recycled water schemes. And it's interesting because I've done a lot of qualitative research with community members, and this is something that does come up, and you think it's a bit of a slam dunk, right? You think, well, if we can just tell them it's done in all these places in the world, surely that will kind of reassure them, right? But it was interesting. I was always interested to see that a lot of people would say something like, oh yeah, but here, this is talking about here in Southeast Queensland, here they plan to do it, in a very purposeful way, and the concentrations will be much higher, because, the dam levels are so low. So it was kind of really interesting to me that it wasn't the kind of reassuring kind of evidence that, that you might think it would be. Yes, I think it reassures some people. So some people who kind of go, oh yeah, well, they're doing it all over the world. What's the big deal? No problem. But for the people who are kind of sitting on the fence and going, oh, I'm not really sure what I should think about that, it doesn't seem to be a kind of slam dunk argument. And it could be, I think Katherine, raises a really wonderful point about, you got to think about, well, what are people's underlying concerns and values? It could be that it just doesn't kind of actually hit on those values. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of give you the sort of like actual experience of being there and hearing those arguments made to people and seeing them kind of just go, no, doesn't work for me.
Can I add to that, Stuart?
Please.
I think if you think about social license as a license, it is a non-transferable license. You can't use a license that you acquired in London to say I'll be able to do that in Dubbo. It can only be acquired in the local registry of local community of Dubbo. So social license is about engaging with the community, and I think the literature is quite clear, and there are plenty of examples that say that the elements of legitimacy and the credibility and trust are only acquired in a sequential manner. You just can't rely on any bypass.
Thanks, Amit.
And if I can add, I think one of the additional challenges there is that people will trust different people. And so there will be great science that says, yes, there's no problems with this at all. And then there'll be some other science that says, well, actually, there may be problems in this situation, and different people will take those two different pieces of science if they align with their values and say, well, look, I have evidence that shows the opposite. And I think that's why it is important, as Amit said, to use that really sort of long-term process of slowly building trust and just general acceptance that this thing is going to be all right, because they've seen it around them, they've learned, their kids have played with it, and it then becomes less problematic for them. It's not something big that they don't know about, it's something that they're really familiar with, and so a teensy tiny step will then probably be easier.
Thanks, Katherine. You've preempted the next question a little bit, Peter's question, which says that he spoke to his wife earlier today about water recycling, and her only comment was, not here, can't trust hospital waste to be removed. Peter says that this comes back to the science and the science community getting behind the topic. He says there are plenty of good and bad examples with COVID-19 and fake news introduced through social media. And he alludes to the need, I think, for one source of truth and for leadership. Do you think that that's a key issue, that that we need to be demonstrating leadership and pushing people in a particular direction? Or is it more of sitting back and listening to communities' preferences and communities' contribution to decision making, and listening and responding to what the community is saying? Where's the balance, and where's the right spot to land there?
If I can draw on what I mentioned at the very end about the climate wars, I think one of the things we learned there is that if science is considered to be a monolith, but there's only one truth, then it's very easy to attack it. And science has always been about trying to pursue and understand where additional knowledge is. We're always trying to add to that body and discount what doesn't necessarily stand up. And so I think being really open about that allows the legitimacy to be built. I think the fact that Kelly showed that beautiful example, I think it was Kelly who showed the example in Perth of, showing all of the the evidence as it was developed and getting the community on side so that they could see the data themselves. It wasn't mitigated by a whole range of scientists. It was sitting there for them to look at. I think that helps to build trust, and it helps to show that we're all on this journey together. And it doesn't allow the science to be attacked in the same way. If you say, we, all scientists agree, blah, it's very easy for one person to say, well, actually, I have some competing evidence.
Absolutely. Other comments on that?
I mean, I think that, it's a tricky thing, I think, because, scientists, have a kind of core value of scientists is to be, value neutral, right? And so, the notion that you'd be out there kind of pushing a particular policy position can be uncomfortable. And it's interesting that Katherine kind of raises the climate wars, because I had a student who did this in relation, talking to climate scientists about this very kind of issue, and how comfortable do you feel with that notion of, kind of being an advocate. So, I mean, obviously I'm not a, kind of an engineer or scientist, I'm a, environmental psychologist, but, my perspective is that what we're trying to do is to kind of create a context in which people can come to their own well-informed decisions, right? That we're not sort of trying to say, you should think this or you should think that people have all of the evidence, the good evidence that they need in order to actually reach their own decisions about what they think is the best way forward. And of course, there's going to be competing evidence, and, it's kind of interesting, we did some research, qualitative research in Toowoomba, kind of talking to people who had voted for and against. And it's fascinating to hear people talk about, who influence, those kind of decisions. And, we often have this idea that people are opponents kind of just don't know, but actually they're often the ones who do way more research than the people who are the proponents, but they just look to different sources of information. They pay attention to different things to what we do, to what we pay attention to. So I suppose my sort of take home message is it's about communicating, engaging to kind of build the ability for people to make informed, decisions, rather than us, I think, necessarily saying, this is what, you should believe, or this is what, you should support.
Great, thanks, Kelly. John's asked a question specifically to Amit, although I think he's asked a couple of questions in one, and it's the later one that I think is the most interesting, and I'd like to hear from all of us on. The question says that he says COVID antibodies and traces of the virus itself have been found in sewage. I assume he's referring to the fact that we can monitor the RNA, fragments of RNA in particular, of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in wastewater. And he says that that's been used to track different international societies' exposure to the virus, so what we call wastewater-based epidemiology. He asks, the first question is, do viruses such as COVID get filtered out by the reverse osmosis process? That might be a little bit off topic for what we're talking about today. If somebody'd like to address it, they're welcome to. Otherwise, I'll throw in the fact that we haven't come across a virus yet that can't be, and SARS-CoV-2 is a much bigger and less strongly structured virus than most. I think the more interesting question is the next part, which says, do you believe that the COVID pandemic has affected communities' social license for recycled sewage before being used as potable water? So has the fact that, we're talking about wastewater-based epidemiology, we're talking about the fact that there are viruses in sewage, or at least we can measure fragments of viruses in sewage. Is this going to affect public perception? Is it going to have an impact on social license? Who wants to have a shot? Amit?
Look, I think, thank you for handling the first part of the question. So in terms of the membrane pore sizes of 0.001, microns, I think you're right in terms of, their ability to take on most of the, viruses and bacteria. They're quite effective. Whether pandemic will have an impact on communities' acceptance, I think it's all to do with how the narrative is framed and how we inform the community. In fact, in one sense, it is actually, the science is actually playing quite a proactive role in the fact that we can detect these viruses and possibly early detection of pandemic presence in a particular cluster. So it is about how that narrative is discussed. and how that's translated into communities' awareness of the matter. I'm not a pandemic or health expert in that sense, but my view would be that, and noting that I'm already on the side of the abyss where I'm ready to drink, that I think the giving faith in the fact that we are able to detect, and because we are able to detect, we are able to treat, is actually, we need to have the narrative that's complete rather than just saying, oh, there's virus there, therefore don't touch it. It needs to be a complete narrative, which is about we can detect, we can remove, and we can assure that it has been removed before we ask you to drink it. And that's the whole story, rather than saying there's virus and that's it. I hope that answers it in some way.
Very much. Thank you, Amit. Look, Ian's asked a question, which is very similar to a question I had offline as well. And he says, ATSI did a study of technical aspects of water recycling in 2004. So 16 years ago, this was John Radcliffe's
report,
landmark Water Recycling in Australia report. And it says the final sentence of the report was, ensuring public confidence and support is fundamental to future recycled water initiatives. And Ian remarks, it's taking a while. The question that I had was, how long do we have to keep having this same conversation and this same discussion? When do we move on? When do we feel that we can start thinking about the next steps and implementing projects?
I think I kind of covered that in my talk, that I believe that this topic and this conversation right now is actually really commendable, because this is the time we should be having that conversation, because often the bureaucrats responsible for the drought response wake up when the dams are at 5%, and then it's quite late to have those conversations, and as a result we end up going down the path of implementing solutions with no social licensing. So I think ATSI has a role to play, and all of us have a role to play in having that public discussion and dialogue that allows us to pick options that we can't if we are in the middle of drought. So let's continue this discussion. Let's continue this dialogue with the policymakers, with the right bureaucrats, with the right, the politicians. I feel that there are a lot of in the political sphere, there are a lot of progressive-minded people in our state as well as in other states who are actually open to this discussion, which is a really good opportunity.
I would like to jump in and say the best time would be just after you've been elected and up to an election. Anyone who's watching the situation in Queensland will know that the opposition have decided to come out against the introduction of recycled water, I believe, as a policy, part of their policy platform. So what that means is if you are an incumbent government, the last thing you want to be doing is having conversations about recycled water. So I would think it within the political cycle, and I think, we can't ignore those political cycles, then the time to start having the conversations, to start doing the engagement is when you've just been elected, and that you've got kind of a 3 or 4 year period to sort of have the conversation. Anyway, that's my throwaway kind of response. Oops, wrong thing.
I think one of the interesting things is that there has been quite a lot of change since 2004. So back when we were talking about that report, it was about recycled water generally. And I remember in South Australia when I was there, people didn't want a purple pipe anywhere near them or on the Oval or anywhere else. Now most people don't blink an eye when they see a purple pipe on a field to irrigate something. So I really do think the conversation has moved substantially. Yes, there are still challenges around individual developments and health regulations and all sorts of other issues that haven't been resolved, mainly because I think recycled water is complicated because it deals with multiple parts of government and multiple businesses, and multiple communities. So you need health departments, you need water departments, you need infrastructure departments all together. And so whenever you need to work across departments, it makes it more complicated, and across businesses and communities. So I think all of the pilot projects that Amit was talking about, there have been huge numbers across Australia now. And I think most of those have gone fairly well with typical recycled water. And I think that's why having these small scale ones, and it may be in different parts of the country where there aren't other options would be the way of slowly moving things forward, where you can get a little bit of, you know, it might be in mining communities where you can get a little bit of acceptance.
That's a great point, Katherine, and it's absolutely true. If you go back to 2004, a lot of the social research that was coming out, particularly some of the great stuff coming out from Adelaide at the time, was about being nervous about, will people accept dual reticulation schemes, purple pipe schemes, and what could they possibly use it for? Is it okay to water the garden or to flush the toilets? And you look how far we've come, and I absolutely agree. It's not controversial at all. It's extremely popular to be able to use recycled water, the way City of Sydney is increasingly doing all over the place. Building on that, and you've all answered this to some degree now, I think, but just building on it a little bit further, Richard's asked, if we are to progress this debate within the community, do the panel members have thoughts on the best way forward? So do we engage governments and local governments, or are there perhaps other steps that we need to be taking as well?
I can comment on that. As part of our sort of long-term strategic plan, Sydney's current long-term plan is Sydney 2030, but now we are in the middle of planning for Sydney 2050. And we did quite an extensive community engagement on all things, not just environment, but economy, community, affordable housing. And it was quite interesting to see the level of acceptance on part of community with regards to recycling and doing more water harvesting and reuse. I think nearly 80% of respondents are supportive of what City's been doing and asking for more, which is quite a significant number. And if you look back from when we first started, I think that number has been steadily growing, and that is quite an encouraging number in terms of our community's openness and acceptance of it.
Yeah, I think one of the things is to start small. I think one of the things we've seen is if you go too big too fast, like a big referendum, it doesn't tend to work very well. So I think it's often better to start with a local community where there may be changes, to work with those people, with the governments, with the local catchment authorities, and to see what they want for the future. And often you'll find that they will be interested in rainwater tanks and recycled water and all sorts of other things as part of their future. And then it's a matter of seeing what is actually feasible and who's willing to put that in place for them. And that's where they'll start to see what the options are. But I think if it goes too big too fast, I think wind energy has also shown us that a lot of the community acceptance, you can have the biggest plan in the world and often it will backfire. So it can often be better to start small and to slowly ramp up.
I think the other thing to kind of put in there is that a lot of the schemes that have been successful have had some kind of experiential aspect to them. You know, so, I mean, that's a pretty tricky thing to do, I think, in smaller regional cities, you know, because they often are quite, you know, like having a visitor centre, you know, that's something, you know, like that Singapore's had, or, you know, Perth had, and they're big and expensive, right? But I don't know whether, like, you know, so maybe there's other kind of opportunities for more experiential kind of, you know, engagement. So I'm thinking, for example, I did a project with SA Water that they had to sort of take the tap test, you know, where they'd go out to sort of, you know, community events and, you know, invite people to come up and taste different waters and guess what waters, you know, which waters they were and say which one they liked the best and the least. It's a way to start a conversation. So I think you could do that kind of experiential engagement at a smaller scale, you know, like a less kind of, you know, big demo. You know, you could probably have this sort of demo projects and take school kids out to that as well. But it has been a very integral part of successful schemes, is to kind of give people that more kind of not just hearing but kind of experience of it.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm jumping around a little bit here. I'm going to go back to the question of COVID again. It's been raised again by Angela in the questions, and she's talking about how this is something that she's experienced firsthand in Perth, working on the groundwater replenishment scheme over there for 10 years. She said that she's become acutely conscious of the fact that this is an issue that comes up in the community. She says that she feels that the organisations need to tackle the question and the question of the detection and the removal of these of this substance needs to be head on, because if it's not COVID this year, or from a particular community member, it'll be methamphetamine in wastewater, it'll be hormones in wastewater. So she's suggesting that do we need to be doing more work and doing more research and more public communications to be able to convincingly make the case that our water treatment processes are up to providing safe, clean, reliable drinking water 100% of the time?
I think that's completely the right thing to do, and the more data-driven conversations we can have, the better it will be for communities' understanding. I'm pretty sure that in one of the European utilities have already done that. They had created this poster with the size of the coronavirus particle and what what is the filter RO membrane filtration capacity is. I think it's 0.14 micron is the coronavirus, Stuart. You probably would be able to recite that off the top of your head. And there are posters created by either an Italian or a Spanish utility. They're already doing that. And I think we should certainly do that so that people can clearly see that there is nothing to be afraid of in that sense.
I think the other thing that we've learned a lot over recent years is that people having the data at their own fingertips, so on their phone, being able to see it, they see it go in and they see it come out, like with bushfires and all sorts of other alerts and dam levels on the Bureau's app. I think that kind of thing is something that can also help, because people then come accustomed to seeing what the level is. So if they see that it's been, you know, zero forever, they go, oh, that's fairly boring. But it does then at least show, you can see the sort of the before and the after. And I think just having that transparency and people being able to see what the results are, that they're not behind a firewall and it's not only a certain number of government staff who can have access to that, I think that can really help in these kinds of situations, because it just means that people can check themselves.
On that note, I think I'm going to thank our three excellent speakers for a great webinar, very informative, very interesting and very engaging. So thank you very much to me, and I'll pass back to Professor Green.
Well, thanks, Stuart. So it's my pleasure to give a vote of thanks to our panelists and our moderator. It has been incredibly interesting, and I've made a lot of notes. One of the things that's clear is that there is still resistance to drinking treated wastewater, even though purified recycled water for drinking is acceptable and common in many countries overseas. And several of the speakers mentioned the difference. So educating the community is critical, and the way that the data and policies are presented seems to be very important. And Kelly said, engage early, engage often, and Amit mentioned that perception is the key. And from Katherine, gradual progress and small steps. So it's been really very interesting, and I take heart that there was encouragement for ATSI to carry on these discussions and develop policies further. So there will be scenarios for the way forward, and managing competing interests, of course, is very complex. However, I mean, if the community doesn't grant a social license for the effective and high quality recycling of wastewater, we're in trouble. I mean, our water resources are limited and they're precious, and we just can't afford to flush potable water down the sewer. I mean, that's, I guess, the bottom line. However, this now brings our webinar to a close. Thank you so much to our panelists for their time, and to our moderator, Stuart, and to also the Secretariat at ATSI for their support. And to all of you for attending. I hope you have learned a lot from this webinar, and I wish you all continued health and safety in these rather uncertain times. So this is the end of the webinar. Thank you and good afternoon.